Talia, please. I have nowhere else to go. You're the only one who can help.
You don't get to show up like this, Marcus, not after what you did.
Please nurse him just once more. Marcus Kane's voice broke on the last word. Standing in a doorway he had no right to be standing in anymore, holding a baby who wouldn't stop crying for anyone but her. That's where this one starts. Not with a wedding, not with a war, with a man who once ran an entire city with a single look, reduced to begging the woman he let walk away to save the only thing he had left. If you've ever had to choose between protecting your own heart and saving someone you love, you already know exactly how heavy this story is about to get. Go ahead and hit follow before we start, because you are not going to want to miss where this one ends up. Some bonds don't break just because two people stop being married. Some bonds hold on, quietly, underneath everything, waiting for the one moment they're needed most. Her name was Talia Reeves. This is the story of the night her ex-husband showed up at her door with their dying son in his arms, and what it cost her to say yes. Tell me where you're watching from tonight before we go further. I want to see how far this one travels. But let me take you back to the beginning, because none of what happens tonight makes sense unless you understand everything Talia had already survived before that knock ever came. She was 31 years old, and 8 months earlier she had packed one suitcase, taken her infant son, and walked out of the largest estate on the North Shore without looking back. She'd married into the Kane name at 26, young and in love with a man who made her feel like the center of the world for exactly as long as the room allowed it. What she hadn't understood yet, not really, not until years in, was that the room rarely allowed it. Marcus Kane ran shipping routes, casino interests, and enough of the city's quiet machinery that men twice his age stood a little straighter when he walked past. And somewhere in the middle of building all of that, he had forgotten how to actually be present for the family he kept insisting he was building it for. She believed, the way a lot of women believe when they're 26 and in love, that a man like that would eventually slow down for her, that the danger and the distance were temporary, something he'd grow out of once they had a life together worth protecting. She found out 4 years and 1 baby later that some men don't slow down. They just get better at making you believe they will. She had no idea, walking out of that estate 8 months ago with baby Eli on her hip and a single suitcase in her hand, that she would ever set foot back through those gates again. She had built something small and quiet and entirely her own since then, an apartment 2 hours away that Marcus's name meant nothing in, a job, a routine, a version of motherhood that didn't require armed men at the door. She had no idea that on an ordinary Thursday evening, her phone would ring with a number she'd blocked 8 months ago somehow calling anyway, and that the voice on the other end would sound like something breaking. Marcus Kane had never once, in 39 years, believed a man could run 2 lives without one eventually swallowing the other. His father had taught him that lesson the hard way, dying young from a war he'd started and never finished, leaving Marcus the empire and the enemies both at 22 years old, with no time to grieve either. He built on what his father left him the only way he knew how, through control. Shipping lanes up and down the coast, casino licenses that looked clean on paper and weren't always underneath, logistics companies that moved more than cargo. By the time he was 30, the Kane name carried a particular kind of silence into any room it entered, the silence of people choosing their words very, very carefully. He met Talia Reeves at a charity auction he only attended because appearances mattered, and she was working the event as a coordinator, sharp and unbothered by half the wealth in the room in a way that immediately separated her from every other woman he'd ever met in that world. She asked him direct questions. She didn't flinch when he gave her guarded answers, just told him plainly that guarded answers didn't interest her. He married her within 2 years, and for a while it worked the way he'd told himself it would. He believed, the way powerful men often believe, that providing an entire world for someone was the same as being inside it with them. He was wrong, and it took him most of their marriage to understand exactly how wrong, mostly because Talia had spent years trying gently to tell him, and he'd spent years too consumed by his own empire to actually hear it. His right hand through all of it was a man named Victor Cole, who'd been with the Kane organization since Marcus's father's time, a broad, careful man in his 50s who managed the estate's security with the same discipline he'd carried out of the military decades earlier. Victor was loyal in the way only decades of trust can build, and Marcus had never once had reason to question that loyalty, which was precisely why he never noticed the second man standing just close enough to Victor to matter. That second man was Damien Wren, the Kane organization's chief financial officer, a polished, soft-spoken cousin of Marcus's late mother who had managed the family's legitimate holdings for nearly a decade. Damien had built his position carefully, patiently, always 2 steps behind Marcus in public and several steps ahead of him in the quiet architecture of the business's actual money. Nobody questioned Damien. He smiled easily, remembered birthdays, and had never once given anyone in the organization a reason to look twice at him. What nobody knew, including Marcus, was that Damien had spent years quietly diverting funds from 3 of the family's legitimate shipping contracts into accounts that existed nowhere on any book Marcus's lawyers ever reviewed, patient, small enough not to raise flags, large enough that over time it had become millions. And Damien understood something Marcus never did until it was too late. A distracted, isolated Marcus, a Marcus consumed by a crumbling marriage and too proud to ask for help, was a Marcus who wasn't looking closely at his own books. Eli was born in the spring of their 4th year of marriage, and for a handful of weeks, Marcus actually slowed down the way Talia had always hoped he would. He came home before midnight. He held his son and meant it. But the business didn't wait for anyone, and within 2 months he was back to disappearing for days, missing feedings and first smiles because a shipment needed his signature or a rival needed reminding of exactly who he was. Talia told him, over and over, in every way she knew how, that she was lonely inside her own marriage. Damien, always nearby, always gentle and understanding, when Talia vented her frustration during the long stretches Marcus was gone, became someone she trusted more than she should have, not romantically, never that, but as a confidant who always seemed to know exactly the right words to make her feel both understood, and somehow more resigned to the idea that Marcus would never truly change. "He loves you," Damien told her once, quietly, during one of Marcus's longer absences. "He just doesn't know how to be a husband and a king at the same time. I don't think that changes, Talia. I think you have to decide if you can live with half of him forever." She didn't know then that Damien was the one quietly telling Marcus, in separate careful conversations, that Talia was pulling away because she resented the business itself, that she wanted Marcus to choose between his empire and his marriage in a way that made compromise sound impossible. 2 people, isolated from each other by the same soft, reasonable voice, each hearing a slightly different version of a story that was, underneath it, entirely engineered. 8 months ago, on a Thursday that looked exactly like every other Thursday, Talia packed 1 suitcase, lifted 6-month-old Eli into her arms, and told Marcus she was finished. Not screaming, not dramatic, just finished, in the flat, exhausted way of someone who had made the decision long before she ever said it out loud. "I didn't marry the danger," she told him. "I married the man I thought would eventually choose to be here for it. You never did." Marcus hadn't fought the divorce, some quiet part of him already agreeing with her even as the rest of him told a different story to survive it, that she'd left because the world scared her, because a woman like her had never really been built for a life like his. It was easier to believe that than to believe he'd simply chosen the business over her, again and again, until she finally stopped waiting for him to choose differently. Custody split the way it always does in families like his, through lawyers, through paperwork, through scheduled exchanges that made something as simple as raising a child feel like a business transaction. Eli spent alternating weeks at the estate, and every time Talia dropped him at those gates, something in her chest tightened at the sight of the house that had nearly swallowed her whole. She had no idea that Thursday evening 8 months later, that an unfamiliar cry over an unfamiliar phone call was about to pull her back through those gates one final time, and that everything she thought she understood about why her marriage had ended was about to come apart in her hands. Eli had been running a mild fever for 2 days when Talia dropped him off for his scheduled week at the estate, nothing that alarmed her, nothing the pediatrician hadn't already cleared as an ordinary toddler cold. She'd kissed his forehead at the gate the way she always did, watched Victor Cole carry him inside, and driven the 2 hours home telling herself, the way she told herself every single time, that it was fine, that Marcus's staff was competent, that her son was safe there, even if she never fully believed she'd have been. By the second night at the estate, the fever had spiked, and Eli had stopped eating. Marcus stood in the nursery at 11 that night watching his son refuse a bottle for the 4th time, his son's small body limp and unresponsive in a way that made something ancient and terrified rise up in Marcus's chest. He had survived assassination attempts without his pulse changing. He had buried men who died protecting him and felt nothing crack in his composure. None of that mattered now. Nothing in his life had prepared him for the specific helplessness of watching his own child grow weaker while every resource he possessed failed to fix it. Dr. Elena Marsh, the family's longtime pediatrician, a composed woman in her 50s who delivered half the children born into families like the Kanes over the last 2 decades, examined Eli for the 3rd time that evening with the same careful, unhurried hands, though even her calm had begun to fray at the edges. "He's dehydrated and exhausted," she told Marcus quietly, glancing at the row of untouched bottles lined up along the counter. "Whatever's happening with this fever, it's disrupted his feeding reflex badly. I've seen this before in infants under severe stress. Sometimes the body simply refuses anything that doesn't feel completely familiar. If we can't get fluids into him soon, this becomes a hospital situation, possibly critical." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Then we go to the hospital." "We can," Dr. Marsh said carefully, "but I want to try one thing first, because I've seen it work in cases exactly like this. Sometimes an infant, this distressed, will only respond to direct nursing, something his body recognizes on instinct, in a way formula and even bottled breast milk from a stranger simply won't reach." She hesitated, choosing her next words with visible care. "Talia nursed him for the first several weeks of his life, didn't she?" Marcus went very still. "If she's willing," Dr. Marsh continued gently, "and if her body's still producing anything at all this many months out, which isn't guaranteed, but isn't impossible either, it's worth trying before we put him through an emergency room at midnight with a fever this high." Marcus stood there a long moment, staring down at his son's colorless face, and felt something inside him that had nothing to do with his empire and everything to do with 8 months of silence he'd never once tried to break. He picked up his phone. Talia's number was still saved under her name, unchanged since the day she'd left, though he'd never once let himself call it. His thumb hovered over it for a long moment before he pressed down, and it rang 4 times before she picked up, her voice wary and clipped the second she recognized the number that shouldn't have still worked. "Marcus, why are you calling me on this line?" "It's Eli." His voice cracked on the name, and he heard her breath catch instantly on the other end. "He won't eat. He's had a fever for 2 days, and it spiked tonight, and he stopped taking the bottle completely. Dr. Marsh says," he stopped, forcing the words out even though every part of him hated needing to say them. "She says he might respond to you, directly, that it might be the only thing that reaches him right now." Silence stretched long enough that Marcus thought the line had dropped. "Talia." "I'm here." Her voice had gone thin, careful, the voice of a woman doing frantic math on 8 months of hard-won distance, collapsing in real time. "How high is the fever?" 103, climbing." Another silence, shorter this time. "I'm coming," she said, and he heard keys jangling somewhere on her end already. "Don't take him anywhere. I'm 2 hours out. I'm leaving right now." The line went dead before Marcus could say thank you, and he stood in the nursery holding his son, feeling something close to hope for the first time in 2 days. Talia drove those 2 hours faster than she ever had in her life, her hands locked on the wheel, her mind refusing to let itself imagine anything beyond the next mile of road. She hadn't set foot past those gates in 8 months. She'd told herself, standing in her small apartment, building a life free of the Kane name, that she never would again. And now she was driving straight back into it, because some part of her body remembered, instantly and completely, what it felt like to be the only thing standing between her son and something terrible. The gates opened for her the moment her car approached, Victor Cole already waving her through without a word, his usually composed face tight with worry. She left her car running in the circular drive and ran up the front steps 2 at a time, and the front door opened before she reached it. Marcus stood there with Eli against his chest, and for one suspended second, neither of them said anything at all. He looked exhausted in a way she'd never once seen him look during their entire marriage, not tired from work, not tired from the business, but hollowed out, stripped down to something raw and human that the Marcus she'd married had never once let her see. "Please," he said, his voice breaking on the single word. "Nurse him, just once more, I don't know what else to do." Talia looked past him at her son's small, pale face, and every carefully rebuilt wall she'd spent 8 months constructing came down at once. She stepped forward and reached out both arms. "Give him to me," she said. "If you've ever had to walk back through a door you swore you'd never open again, just to save someone you love, stay with me, because what Talia finds inside that house is only the beginning of what's coming." Talia carried Eli into the small sitting room off the nursery, the same room where she'd nursed him countless times in the first weeks of his life, before any of this had fallen apart. Her hands moved with an instinct she hadn't used in 8 months, positioning him carefully, murmuring low and steady, words too soft for Marcus to hear from where he stood frozen in the doorway. At first Eli didn't respond, his small body limp against her, and Talia's own heart climbed into her throat with fear she refused to let show on her face. She stroked his cheek once, gently, and whispered his name. Then, weakly, he turned toward her. The sound that followed was almost nothing, a faint, exhausted rhythm in an otherwise silent room. But Marcus heard it from the doorway, and something in his chest cracked open completely. He stood with both hands hanging useless at his sides, watching his son nurse for the first time in 2 days, watching color slowly, impossibly begin returning to a face that had been gray with exhaustion 20 minutes earlier. Dr. Marsh, standing quietly near the window, exhaled and gave a slow nod. But Marcus didn't look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on his son's small hand curling weakly against Talia's sweater, and without a sound, without attempting to hide it, Marcus Kane lowered his head and began to cry. By the time the fever finally started to break near 2 in the morning, Eli had fed for nearly 20 minutes and fallen into the first real sleep he'd had in 2 days. Talia sat in the chair holding him long after he'd drifted off, unwilling to move, unwilling to trust that the danger had actually passed. Dr. Marsh checked his pulse twice more and finally, gently, assured them both that the immediate crisis had passed, though he'd need close observation and repeated feeding over the next several days to fully stabilize. Relief should have felt like relief. Instead, standing in that room with the woman he'd let walk away 8 months earlier, Marcus felt something closer to exposure, the specific, humbling realization that his money, his empire, and every resource at his disposal had failed his son completely. And the only thing that had actually worked was a woman he'd spent 8 months telling himself he didn't need. When Eli finally settled fully asleep against Talia's chest, Marcus asked everyone else to leave the room. He waited until the door closed before he spoke, his voice careful, controlled in the way it always was when he was trying to survive something that scared him. "Stay," he said, not forever, just until he's stable. A few days, maybe a week. I'll have a room prepared, full medical staff, whatever you need, I'll cover anything." He hesitated, the negotiator in him reaching automatically for terms, for structure, for anything that made this feel manageable instead of impossibly personal. "It's temporary." Talia looked down at her sleeping son rather than at the man making the offer. She knew what staying meant, walking back through gates she'd sworn never to pass again, sleeping under a roof that had nearly cost her everything, exposing herself once more to a life she'd fought 8 months to escape. "I'll stay," she said finally, quiet but certain. "Not because of anything you're offering me, because I'm not walking out of this house not knowing if he's going to be okay the moment I'm gone." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, unused to anyone refusing the comfort of his terms. "Talia." "I mean it, Marcus. She met his gaze steadily, exhaustion and old grief both plain on her face. This isn't a reconciliation. This is me making sure our son survives the week. Don't confuse the two. He studied her for a long moment, searching for any performance in her words and finding none, only the raw, unguarded honesty of a woman who had already lost enough and refused to pretend otherwise. He nodded once and said nothing else, because there was nothing else that wouldn't have sounded like exactly the kind of pressure she'd just told him not to apply. The estate that had once made Talia feel like a stranger in her own home felt, somehow, even stranger walking back into it now, familiar in every hallway, foreign in the way it seemed to know she'd left and come back. Teresa Marino, the estate's longtime housekeeper, a compact woman in her late 50s who'd loved Talia quietly from the start and had never fully forgiven Marcus for letting her go, met them at the top of the stairs with red-rimmed eyes and a fierce, immediate embrace that startled Talia more than anything else that night. "I prayed," Teresa said, gripping Talia's arm. "Every night since you left, I prayed this house would get its heart back somehow. I didn't think it would be like this." Talia didn't have an answer for that. She let Teresa lead her to the same guest suite beside the nursery she'd stayed in during Eli's earliest weeks, and spent the first 2 days almost entirely there, relearning the rhythm of her son's hunger, the sound he made before waking, the way he settled the instant her palm found the center of his back. By the third morning, moving through the kitchen to warm a bottle of pumped milk for later, Talia noticed the same thing she'd noticed years earlier during her marriage and had almost forgotten. The mansion ran in a state of quiet disorder that money alone had never fixed. Breakfast trays arriving late and half-eaten. Expensive groceries spoiling because no one tracked what was actually being used. The household's longtime cook, Emilio Rossi, a proud, heavy-set man in his 60s who'd once run kitchens in Manhattan's finest hotels, moving through his own kitchen like a man who'd stopped believing anyone actually tasted what he made. She didn't ask permission. She simply started organizing the pantry the way she used to, labeling and rotating supplies, and when Emilio bristled at first, she reminded him, gently, that she remembered exactly how good his bread used to be before grief had emptied this house of anyone who noticed. Within days, the smell of fresh bread was moving through the mansion's cold corridors again, and guards who used to eat standing up in silence began gathering at the long staff table, tearing loaves apart with their hands, talking quietly to each other in a way Talia hadn't heard in this house in years. Marcus noticed every bit of it without saying a word about it, coming home earlier each evening, lingering outside the nursery long after Eli had fallen asleep, more than once catching himself standing frozen in the hallway when the scent of fresh bread hit him, remembering mornings years earlier when Talia had insisted a house should smell like a family actually lived in it. 2 weeks into what was supposed to be a temporary stay, Eli slept for 6 uninterrupted hours for the first time since the fever began. Talia stood beside his crib until she was sure his breathing had steadied, and when she finally stepped into the hallway, Marcus was there, still in his overcoat despite having been home nearly an hour, watching the nursery door the way a man watches something he's terrified of losing again. He said nothing about it. He only handed his coat to Teresa and walked toward his son instead of returning to his office, and Talia stood there a long moment, watching him go, feeling something old and complicated stir back to life in her chest that she wasn't ready yet to name. If you thought this was just going to be a quiet reunion story, that's not what's actually happening here, because something in this house isn't right, and Talia's about to be the only one who notices it. Stay with me. The first sign seemed too small to matter, the way these things always do until they don't. Nearly a month into Talia's stay, Eli had grown steadily stronger, his cheeks filling back out, his fever a distant memory, his tiny hands reaching for Talia the moment she entered any room he was in. She still told herself every single day that this was temporary, that as soon as he was fully stable, she'd take him home and go back to the quiet, ordinary life she'd built 2 hours and 1 lifetime away. She hadn't managed to actually pack a bag yet. One evening, after nursing Eli down for the night, Talia reached into the nursery's emergency formula cabinet, intending only to check the expiration dates on the backup supply in case she was ever unavailable to feed him herself. She'd organized that cabinet herself 3 days earlier, marking each container with a small red dot on the lid so she could rotate stock correctly, an old habit from years of managing her own bakery's inventory back before any of this. 2 of the containers had no mark at all. The labels matched, the seals looked untouched, but Talia knew with the same certainty that had once caught pricing errors and spoiled stock before they cost her thousands that these weren't the same cans she'd marked 3 days earlier. She said nothing to anyone, quietly returned them to the shelf, and told herself she'd check again in the morning. The next evening confirmed it. The marked containers had moved again, rearranged in a way no one in the household admitted to touching. Talia examined every can under the nursery light, unable to identify anything visibly wrong with the powder itself, but the unease sat heavy and cold in her stomach regardless. Dr. Marsh had told her repeatedly how fragile Eli's system still was after the fever, how dangerous it would be to introduce anything altered or contaminated during this recovery window. She didn't go to Marcus first. Instead, she went to Dr. Marsh directly, explaining everything in careful detail, and the older woman's calm expression tightened into something far more serious as she examined the suspicious containers under her own equipment. "Preliminary testing shows nothing obvious," Dr. Marsh said quietly, "but I agree we shouldn't feed him from anything we can't personally verify. I'll send these to an independent lab." Quietly, "No one inside this house needs to know until we understand what we are dealing with." Talia nodded, though some part of her already suspected the answer would be worse than simple carelessness. Someone had replaced sealed containers without disturbing them, and only someone with real access to this household could have managed that. She started paying closer attention after that, to the household's routines, to who came and went, to small details that had never mattered to her before because she'd never had reason to look. She noticed the nursery hallway's security cameras occasionally lost footage for a few minutes at a time, always late at night, always dismissed by the household's technicians as agging equipment. She mentioned the pattern to Victor Cole, whose careful, disciplined expression sharpened instantly at the details she laid out. Victor brought in the estate's surveillance specialist, a quiet, precise young man named Isaiah Cruz, who spent hours combing through system logs before delivering the news flatly, without embellishment. The missing footage hadn't been equipment failure. Someone with administrator-level access had deliberately erased it. The unease in Talia's chest deepened further when she thought to ask about Marisol Vega, a warm, capable night nurse who'd cared for Eli during the worst of his fever and then abruptly resigned less than a week later, telling Teresa only that a family emergency required her to leave the city. When Talia casually asked whether Marisol had ever come back for her final paycheck, Teresa's face went blank with confusion. No one had heard from her since. The address in her employment file belonged to an apartment that had sat empty for weeks, according to neighbors Isaiah quietly tracked down. No forwarding information, no trace. Talia couldn't convince herself any of it was coincidence anymore. Rather than confronting Marcus with suspicions she couldn't yet prove, she began quietly documenting everything: dates, times, names, small inconsistencies. Inside a notebook she kept hidden beneath folded baby blankets in the nursery closet. Victor, without asking unnecessary questions, gave her quiet access to the estate's visitor logs, trusting her instincts after watching her steady, careful presence in this house for the past month. Piece by piece, a pattern emerged that turned Talia's blood cold. Every erased security recording lined up, exactly, with visits from one particular member of the household. Damien Wren. He rarely entered the nursery himself, always polished, always warm, always the kind of presence nobody thought twice about because he'd been a fixture in this family for a decade. Marcus's late mother's cousin, trusted with the family's legitimate holdings, gentle and soft-spoken in a way that made him invisible in a house full of harder, more obviously dangerous men. Talia remembered him now with a different kind of clarity than she'd had during her marriage, remembered every quiet, understanding conversation he'd had with her during those long, lonely months before she left. Every gentle suggestion that maybe Marcus simply couldn't change, that maybe she needed to decide if she could live with half of him forever. She'd trusted Damien's counsel completely back then. She'd never once considered that his understanding words might have been doing something else entirely, patiently, carefully widening a gap that was already there. Isaiah eventually recovered enough deleted metadata to confirm that Damien's security credentials had authorized restricted nursery camera access on every date the footage had gone missing, though the actual video remained unrecoverable. And a few days later, Dr. Marsh received preliminary lab findings from the independent facility she'd quietly sent the formula containers to. Trace elements inside the substituted cans suggested deliberate contamination, something capable of causing severe intestinal illness in an infant already weakened by fever. The report stopped short of naming a specific substance, but the conclusion was unmistakable. Someone had been trying to make Eli gravely ill in a way that would look, to anyone not paying close attention, like a tragic complication of an ordinary childhood fever. Talia sat with that report in her hands, cold despite the warmth of the nursery, and understood she had enough now to bring this to Marcus. But some careful, guarded part of her, the same part that had learned, during 4 years of marriage, exactly how dangerous accusations against family could become in this world, wanted one more piece of proof that couldn't possibly be questioned before she said a single word. That chance never came. 2 days later, Talia left the estate through the service entrance to pick up specialty flour for Emilio from a market a few blocks away, insisting on the short walk despite Victor's protests. He assigned 2 guards to trail her at a discreet distance, but a delivery truck blocking the narrow street separated them for less than 90 seconds. That was long enough. A gloved hand clamped over her mouth from behind as she turned into a quiet side street. Something sharp bit into her neck. The world tilted white and gray, and the bag of flour slipped from her fingers, spilling across the pavement, and by the time the guards rounded the corner, only her scattered groceries remained. Less than 30 minutes later, Marcus stood in his office overlooking the harbor when his private phone buzzed once with a single photograph. Talia, tied to a chair inside what looked like an abandoned warehouse, her wrists bound, her eyes still burning fiercely into the camera despite everything. Beneath the image, 2 short lines. Choose the son or the mother. If you thought this story was already devastating, hold on, because what happens over the next 10 minutes decides whether this family survives the night at all. The harbor lay under a thick winter fog, cranes standing motionless like watchmen over rusted warehouses, the air thick with salt and diesel, and the particular stillness that precedes violence. Inside the Kane estate, there was no shouting, no chaos. Only a silence that every man who'd served Marcus long enough had learned to fear more than any raised voice. Marcus stood in his office, Talia's photograph glowing on the polished desk in front of him, his jaw locked, his eyes fixed on her bound wrists, and the defiance still visible on her face, even through the grain of a phone camera. Victor Cole stood a few feet away, saying nothing, because he had followed Marcus through 2 decades of wars and betrayals and had never once seen him look exactly like this. Marcus wasn't panicking. He was deciding how many lives would end before sunrise. His phone rang exactly 6 minutes later. Marcus answered without a greeting. Damien Wren's voice came through the line calm and measured, sounding less like a man holding a kidnapped woman and more like a businessman closing a routine deal. He reminded Marcus, in that same soft, reasonable tone Talia had once trusted without question, that the family had survived this long by making difficult decisions without sentiment attached. Then he repeated the words from the photograph. Choose the son, Marcus, or choose her. I need you to understand that you can't have both anymore, not with what I've built underneath you these last 10 years. She's already started pulling threads that would unravel everything, and you're too distracted by her to notice you're standing in the middle of it. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression giving nothing away. When Damien finished, expecting negotiation Expecting the fear and desperation he'd clearly counted on, Marcus said only one thing. "You raised me thinking you were smarter than everyone in this family. You were never smarter, you were just patient." Then he hung up. He handed the phone to Isaiah, who began tracing the signal within seconds, fingers moving fast across encrypted tracking software until a blinking coordinate settled on an abandoned shipping terminal near the eastern docks, shuttered since a warehouse fire nearly a decade earlier. Marcus looked at the map once, fastened the buttons of his overcoat, and said only, "We're leaving." Word moved through the Kane organization with a speed that startled even the men who'd served Marcus for years. Convoys rolled out from warehouses, casinos, and private security compounds scattered across the city. Hundreds of men who owed Marcus their loyalty for reasons that had nothing to do with fear, men he'd pulled out of poverty, out of prison, out of rival organizations that had discarded them, answered without needing to ask why. Marcus wasn't coming to negotiate. He'd already made that decision the moment he saw the photograph. Inside the warehouse, Talia fought to stay conscious, her wrists bound to a steel chair overlooking a frozen loading dock, while armed men guarded every entrance below. Damien stood a few feet away in an expensive charcoal coat, entirely untouched by the dirt and rust surrounding him, looking, as always, like a man attending a business meeting rather than orchestrating a kidnapping. "You complicated things," he told her, almost gently, "simply by caring too much about a child who was never yours to begin with. He's still Marcus's blood. You could have walked away 8 months ago and stayed away. Instead, you came back and started noticing things you had no business noticing." Talia said nothing, fear lodged deep in her chest, but no longer controlling her the way it had in the first minutes after she'd woken up here. She thought of Eli, safely back at the estate, and found something steady underneath the terror. The same steadiness that had once carried her out the front gates with a single suitcase, the same steadiness that had carried her back through them 8 months later, without hesitation, the moment her son needed her. Damien mistook her silence for surrender. He had no idea she was quietly praying that whatever happened to her, Eli would stay protected, and that some stubborn, unkillable part of her still believed Marcus would come. The first explosion tore through the warehouse's eastern wall a little after 2 in the morning, glass and steel shattering inward as flash grenades flooded the space with blinding light and deafening sound. Victor led the first team through the smoke, calling out precise commands, while disciplined gunfire echoed through the empty loading bays. Marcus entered moments later, moving through the chaos with a terrifying, absolute calm, every step deliberate, every decision final. Men who tried to flee found every exit already sealed by Kane's soldiers who knew these docks better than the men Damien had hired to guard them. Damien's composure finally cracked when he understood, watching the warehouse fall apart around him floor by floor, that he had badly underestimated exactly how far Marcus Kane would go for the woman he'd let walk away 8 months earlier. He tried to run for the docks, hopping to reach a boat hidden beyond the cranes. Victor intercepted him before he made it halfway there. By the time the sun began breaking weakly through the fog, every man Damien had brought with him had either surrendered or fallen. Paramedics rushed toward Talia the second the building was secured, but Marcus reached her first, dropping to his knees in front of the steel chair, his hands trembling as he worked the bindings loose from her wrists. "I'm all right," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "I'm all right, Marcus." He didn't say anything at first. He simply pulled her into his arms, right there on the cold concrete floor, in front of every soldier, driver, and lieutenant still gathered across the frozen harbor. None of them had ever once seen Marcus Kane show this kind of visible emotion in public, not even during his marriage. He turned, still holding her, to face every man watching, his voice carrying easily across the silent dock. "From this moment forward," he said, "anyone in this organization who threatens her again answers to me personally. That's not a warning. That's the last thing I'll ever say about it." No one answered because no answer was needed. Every man standing there understood exactly what that declaration meant. If you thought getting Talia back was the end of this story, It's really not, because what happens between the two of them after this night is the part that actually decides whether this family gets a real second chance. Stay with me. The weeks after the warehouse moved slower than either of them expected, the adrenaline of the rescue giving way to something quieter and in some ways harder to sit inside. Damien's arrest and the unwinding of his decade of quiet theft dominated the organization's attention for a while. The shell accounts, the diverted contracts, the careful architecture of a betrayal that had cost the family millions and, far more devastatingly, had cost Marcus and Talia years neither of them could get back. Damien never faced anything as clean as a courtroom. What became of him inside that world stayed, as these things often do, permanently unspoken. Talia stayed at the estate through the rest of Eli's recovery, and when Dr. Marsh finally cleared him fully, she found herself standing in the nursery doorway with a packed bag, facing the exact decision she'd been avoiding for weeks. Go home. Return to the small, quiet, ordinary life 2 hours away that had never once asked anything painful of her. Marcus found her there, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, he didn't reach for negotiation. He simply asked, quietly, if she'd sit with him a moment before she left. They ended up on the back terrace, overlooking the estate's frozen gardens, the same terrace where, years earlier, in a different lifetime of their marriage, Marcus had once promised her things would be different and hadn't managed to keep it. I know I can't undo 4 years in one conversation, he said, looking out at the grey light instead of at her. I know protection and money were never what you actually needed from me. I spent most of our marriage acting like they were the same thing, and I understand if that's not something one terrifying month suddenly fixes. Talia sat with that a long moment, turning it over carefully. You didn't fail because you were dangerous, Marcus, she said finally. I could have handled dangerous. I told you that the night I left, and I don't think you ever actually believed me. I left because I was lonely inside a marriage that looked, from the outside, like I had everything. I believe you now, he said. For 8 months I told myself you left because you couldn't handle who I was. It took almost losing both you and Eli in the same month to understand that was never true. You handled everything. I was the one who never showed up. I'm not saying yes to anything tonight, she said carefully. I need you to hear that. I'm not moving back into this house because a crisis finally forced the right words out of you. I know, Marcus said. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking for the chance to actually show you slowly instead of just telling you, however long that takes. She didn't answer him that night, but she also didn't leave the way she'd planned to. Over the months that followed, Marcus did something he had never once done during their entire marriage. He showed up on her terms instead of his own. He didn't push for her to return to the estate. Instead, he rented a small house 2 streets from her apartment, splitting his time in a way that made him, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely inconvenienced by his own family rather than the other way around. He learned Eli's actual daily rhythms instead of hearing about them secondhand from staff. He started asking Talia what she needed instead of assuming money and security had always covered it. He restructured significant parts of the organization in the fallout from Damien's betrayal, pushing the family's legitimate shipping and logistics operations further from the parts of the business that had made Talia feel, throughout her entire marriage, like she was raising a child inside a fortress instead of a home. It wasn't a complete transformation, and both of them understood some things about who Marcus was and what his world required weren't going to disappear entirely. But for the first time, it was an honest one, built in front of her instead of promised to her from a distance. Elijah, old enough now to notice patterns the way small children always do before anyone realizes they're watching, began asking some evenings why Daddy stayed for dinner instead of leaving after. Talia never had a clean answer for that. She wasn't sure yet herself exactly what to call what was happening between her and Marcus. Careful, slow, real, in a way their marriage had rarely managed to be even in its best years. Months later, standing in Marcus's office by accident one afternoon, waiting while he finished a call, Talia found paperwork spread across his desk for a foundation he hadn't mentioned to her at all, one built specifically to support mothers navigating custody and safety alongside dangerous or absent partners, women living some version of exactly what she'd lived. He hadn't built it to impress her. He hadn't announced it, hadn't waited for credit. He'd simply done it, quietly, the way a man does something when he's finally stopped performing change and started actually becoming it. She stood there a long moment with the papers in her hands, feeling something in her chest that had been braced and guarded for 8 months finally, completely give way. She wasn't ready yet to call it forgiveness, but she understood, standing in that office, that for the first time since she'd packed that single suitcase, she wanted to find out what came next instead of protecting herself from it. If you've ever watched someone stop apologizing for who they used to be and actually start becoming someone different, you know exactly what was happening in that quiet office, and there's still more of this story left. Stay with me for what happens next. It was nearly a year after the warehouse when Marcus asked Talia to attend the public opening of the foundation she'd found paperwork for that afternoon in his office. The Isabel Grace Kane Foundation, named quietly, without asking her opinion first, for a stillborn sister he'd lost as a boy, a piece of his own history he'd never once told Talia about during their entire marriage. It was one more thing, she realized, standing in the crowd that evening, that 4 years of marriage had never actually surfaced. She was still learning him, even now, even after everything. The ceremony took place inside a restored library downtown, television cameras and reporters and city officials filling the grand hall, all of them there to cover what looked, on paper, like a straightforward philanthropic announcement. Mayor Diane Okafor, a composed, sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who'd spent years negotiating carefully around the edges of the Kane name, stood near the front, openly acknowledging that the foundation represented one of the most significant private investments in support services for at-risk mothers the city had ever seen. Nobody in that room expected the evening to become something far more personal than a ribbon cutting. After finishing his prepared remarks about responsibility and rebuilding lives, Marcus didn't return to his seat. He stepped down from the podium instead and walked directly toward Talia, who stood near the front holding Eli against her hip, Elijah's small hand gripping the hem of her dress beside her. Reporters raised their cameras instinctively, assuming a second announcement was coming. Marcus ignored every lens in the room. He stopped in front of her, and for a long moment, the man who had negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars without a flicker of hesitation seemed to be searching, carefully, for words that mattered more than any of those deals ever had. "A year ago," he said, his voice steady but carrying something raw underneath it that the whole room could hear, "I stood in a doorway and begged you to save our son because I had nothing else left that could. You didn't come back because I asked you to. You came back because you loved him more than you were ever afraid of me, or of this house, or of everything I let this family become while you were still in it." He glanced down at Eli, then at Elijah, who was watching his father with the wide, careful attention small children give to moments they don't fully understand, yet but no matter. "I'm not asking you tonight to forget 4 years I got wrong," Marcus continued, looking back at Talia. "I'm not asking you to pretend the danger isn't real or that this life will ever be simple. I'm asking you to let me keep showing up, not because there's a crisis forcing me to, because I finally understand what showing up actually costs, and I'm choosing to pay it every single day for as long as you'll let me." He knelt then, not for a ring. He didn't reach for one, not yet, understanding somehow that this moment wasn't about that, but simply to be level with both his sons, one hand resting gently on Elijah's shoulder, the other reaching for Eli's small fingers where they curled against Talia's sleeve. "I love you," he said quietly, just to her, though the whole silent room heard it anyway. "Not the version of me that used to disappear, the version I'm trying every day to actually become. I know that has to be earned. I'm asking for the chance to keep earning it." Talia stood there a long moment, tears sliding freely down her face, the entire hall holding its breath around her. She thought of a single suitcase 8 months, now nearly a year, behind her. She thought of a doorway and a broken voice begging her to nurse a dying child. She thought of every quiet, ordinary morning since then, watching a man who had once mistaken providing for presents slowly, painfully, learn the difference. You don't get everything back all at once, she said finally, her voice breaking. You understand that? I understand that, Marcus said. But you can keep showing up, she said, and something in her voice finally fully softened, for however long it takes. The hall erupted into applause loud enough to shake the chandeliers, guests rising to their feet one by one, reporters forgetting to stay impartial. Mayor Okafor wiped discreetly at her eyes. Teresa, Victor, Emilio, Dr. Marsh, and Isaiah stood together near the back, watching with the quiet satisfaction of people who had spent a year witnessing something genuinely difficult heal in front of them. No business triumph, no display of power, no victory over rivals had ever earned Marcus Kane the kind of respect filling that room in that single moment. It had been earned instead by patience, by honesty, and by a woman who had once believed love inside that family could only ever cost her everything, choosing, finally, to believe otherwise. If you've made it this far, you already know this story isn't quite finished. There's one more piece of this ending worth seeing. Stay with me. 2 years after that Thursday night phone call, Winter returned to the city the way it always did, dusting the harbor and the estates, frozen gardens in fresh snow, though nothing about the house felt cold anymore. Much had changed since the warehouse, since the foundation's opening, since a broken voice in a doorway had asked a woman to come back and nurse a child she'd once believed she'd left behind for good. Marcus had spent those 2 years doing exactly what he'd promised, showing up, patiently, without waiting for another crisis to force his hand. He'd restructured the organization further, pushing more of its legitimate operations into daylight, understanding finally that an empire built entirely on fear had never once made his family safer, only more isolated. Talia never moved back into the estate full-time, and Marcus never asked her to. Instead, over those 2 years, the small house near her apartment slowly became something closer to a shared life built on her terms, mornings that started at her kitchen table instead of his, weekends split evenly instead of dictated by his schedule, a rhythm the two of them built together instead of one he simply expected her to fold herself into. She reopened her own small bakery 18 months in, with Marcus's financial support offered strictly as a loan she insisted on repaying herself, dollar by dollar, because independence had never stopped mattering to her just because the man in her life had finally started showing up for it. She named it plainly, without ceremony, Reeves Bakery, her own name on the sign, a small, deliberate reminder to herself every single morning of exactly who she'd fought to remain even while letting someone back in. Eli, now a sturdy, curious 2-year-old with his father's steady dark eyes, toddled through that bakery most mornings before Marcus dropped him off at daycare, reaching for warm bread the moment he cleared the door. Elijah, older now, proud in the particular way older siblings are proud, had taken to calling himself Eli's official taste tester, solemnly approving or rejecting pastries with a seriousness that made every customer in the shop laugh. Every morning at exactly 8 o'clock, a black car stopped outside the bakery, and Marcus never sent a driver in with the boys. He parked himself, walked them both inside, and more mornings than not, stayed long enough for a cup of coffee at the small table by the window, watching Talia move through her own space with an ease and confidence he'd rarely seen in her during their marriage. The ease of a woman who had rebuilt something entirely her own, and then chosen, deliberately, to let someone back into it. One snowy morning, nearly 2 years to the day since he'd stood in her doorway with a dying baby in his arms, Marcus arrived at the bakery a little earlier than usual, both boys bundled against the cold, and found Talia behind the counter exactly where she always was. He didn't kneel this time. There was no crowd, no cameras, no grand public moment. Just a small bakery smelling of cinnamon and fresh bread, 2 boys chattering over a shared pastry at the corner table, and a man who had spent 2 years learning, patiently, what it actually meant to earn something instead of assuming it. He reached into his coat pocket and set a small velvet box on the counter between them, quiet and unhurried, the way everything between them had become. "I'm not asking because of a crisis this time," he said. "I'm asking because I've had 2 years to prove I meant what I said in that library, and I think I hope you've had enough time to believe it." Talia looked down at the box, then back up at him, and something in her face had none of the guarded caution it once carried whenever he reached for anything resembling forever. She reached across the counter and took his hand instead of the box, holding it a long moment first. "Ask me properly," she said softly, "not because you think I need the ring, because you actually want to say it out loud." Marcus smiled, something easy and unguarded that had taken 2 years to fully return to his face. "Talia Reeves," he said, "will you marry me? For real this time? Not because our son needed saving, and not because I finally learned how to show up. Just because I love you, and I'd like to spend the rest of my life proving that every single ordinary morning, the way I've been trying to for 2 years." She said yes, standing behind the counter of a bakery she'd built with her own 2 hands, cinnamon on her fingers and her sons watching with wide, delighted eyes from the corner table. And it felt nothing like the desperate doorway that had once pulled her back into his life. It felt, finally, like a choice made freely by a woman who had already proven, long before he ever asked, that she didn't need saving at all. Sometimes the people who hurt us most also become the ones who prove, over years instead of moments, that real change is possible, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet, unglamorous work of showing up again and again until trust rebuilds itself one ordinary day at a time. Love that survives betrayal doesn't erase what was broken. It simply proves that some bonds are worth the slow, patient work of repair. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments which moment hit hardest. Share it with someone who needs to believe that people really can change, given enough time and enough honesty. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe, because there's another story just like this one coming very soon, and you don't want to miss it.